Flight 771 from Houston to Minneapolis departed at 7:43 p.m. on a Wednesday evening in late April. Captain Stephen Matthews performed his pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that came from 26 years of flying commercial aircraft. The weather briefing had mentioned possible thunderstorms over Missouri, but nothing unusual for spring in the Midwest. First Officer Amanda Rivera reviewed the flight plan while Stephen completed his walk-around. "Looks like we'll be skirting some weather cells around 8:30, Amanda noted. Stephen nodded. "Standard spring flying. We'll keep an eye on the radar and adjust as needed." Neither of them could have known that in 90 minutes they'd face a decision no pilot ever wants to make. Aaron boarded and found his seat in 22A, a window position that would give him a view of the sunset as they flew north. The plane was nearly full, about 160 passengers, families returning from spring vacation in Texas, business travelers heading to meetings in Minneapolis, a high school volleyball team in matching warm-up jackets clustered in the back rows. Flight attendant Marcus Webb moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, helping passengers stow luggage and answering questions. Everything felt routine, safe, ordinary, just another evening flight. But weather systems don't care about routine. Over central Missouri, a severe thunderstorm complex was rapidly intensifying in ways that meteorologists hadn't predicted. Wind shear conditions were developing at multiple altitudes. Hail was forming in clouds that reached up to 45,000 feet, and the storm was moving faster than forecast, directly into the path of Flight 771. The weather radar at Kansas City Center picked up the change and began alerting pilots in the area. Flight 771 was still 30 minutes away from the danger zone. Stephen leveled the aircraft at 37,000 feet as the sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Passengers had settled in. Some were reading, others watching movies on seatback screens, a few already sleeping. The cabin was peaceful, the flight smooth. Amanda monitored the weather radar on her display. "That system ahead is lighting up more than expected," she said. Stephen leaned over to look. The radar showed a line of red and yellow cells, indicating heavy precipitation and turbulence. "Let's request a deviation," Stephen decided. "No point flying through that if we can go around it." He keyed the radio. "Kansas City Center, Flight 771 requesting deviation 30 miles right of course to avoid weather." The controller responded immediately. "Flight 771 approved as requested. Advise when you can return to course." Stephen banked the aircraft gently to the right, starting a wide arc around the storm system. Passengers barely noticed the course change. Aaron glanced out his window at the darkening sky ahead. He could see lightning flickering inside distant clouds, nature's fireworks display. Beautiful and ominous at the same time. But here's what the radar couldn't show them. The storm was developing an unusual structure, with multiple cells rotating around each other, creating unpredictable wind patterns at various altitudes. And the deviation Stephen had requested would take them closer to one of these cells than the radar indicated. Modern weather radar is excellent, but it's not perfect. Sometimes storms hide their true intensity. Sometimes they develop faster than instruments can track. Sometimes pilots make every right decision and still end up in danger. At 8:27 p.m., Flight 771 entered the edge of the storm system. The ride got bumpy. Not terribly rough at first, just moderate turbulence that made passengers grip armrests and pause their drinks. Stephen turned on the seatbelt sign. "Flight attendants, please take your seats," he announced. Marcus and the other attendants quickly secured the cabin and strapped into their jump seats. Stephen reduced speed slightly to turbulence penetration speed, a standard procedure. "Let's just ride this out," he told Amanda. "Should be through it in 10 minutes. But then the plane dropped. Not a small bump, but a sickening fall that felt like the bottom dropped out of the sky. Passengers screamed, unsecured items flew upward, then crashed down. Aaron's stomach lurched into his throat as the plane plummeted through an air pocket. Stephen fought the controls, trying to stabilize. Then they hit an updraft that threw them violently upward. The plane shook so hard that overhead bins burst open, spilling luggage into the aisle. Warning alarms began sounding in the cockpit. Amanda's eyes widened as she scanned the instruments. "We're in severe turbulence. Wind shear detected. Multiple systems showing stress warnings." Stephen's hands were iron on the controls, but the plane was being tossed like a toy. Another violent drop. Passengers were crying, screaming, praying. The volleyball team in the back clutched each other in terror. A flight attendant who hadn't quite reached her jump seat was thrown against the ceiling, then crashed to the floor. Marcus, strapped in near the galley, could only watch helplessly as the cabin descended into chaos. Aaron gripped his armrest so hard his hands ached. Out his window he could see the wing flexing violently, bending in ways that didn't seem possible. Lightning exploded around them, so close he could feel the static electricity making his hair stand on end. The plane rolled left, then right, buffeted by winds that changed direction and intensity by the second. He thought about his family, about his sister who'd be waiting for his call when he landed. Would he land? The thought was terrifying. Wait, this is where it gets critical. A new alarm sounded in the cockpit, one Stephen had hoped never to hear. "Engine 1 compressor stall," Amanda called out, her voice tight with controlled fear. The left engine had ingested hail and was failing. Stephen immediately shut it down before it could catch fire or explode. Now they were on one engine in the middle of a violent storm. "Declaring emergency," Stephen said into the radio. "Flight 771, we've lost an engine due to hail damage. Severe turbulence, requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport." Kansas City Center responded urgently. "Flight 771, nearest suitable is Columbia Regional, bearing 04538 miles, runway 9, length 6,000 feet. Weather there is marginal but improving. Cleared direct, descend to 10,000 feet. Stephen turned the plane toward Columbia, while fighting turbulence that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. But descending meant going deeper into the storm. "We don't have much choice," he told Amanda. "We need to get down and get on the ground." The descent was a nightmare. The plane bucked and shook as Stephen brought it down through the storm layers. With only one engine, their options were limited. If they lost the second engine, they'd become a glider. A very heavy, poorly designed glider falling out of the sky with 160 souls on board. Amanda ran through emergency checklists, her voice steady despite the terror she must have felt. Single-engine descent checklist complete. Approaching 10,000 feet. In the cabin, Marcus used the intercom despite the violent shaking. "Passengers, this is your lead flight attendant. We are experiencing an emergency and will be landing as soon as possible. Remain in your seats with seat belts fastened. Place your head down and brace. Crew, prepare for emergency landing." His voice was remarkably calm given the circumstances, a testament to his training and professionalism. Passengers assumed crash positions, some crying, some silent, all terrified. Aaron put his head down against the seat in front of him, his heart hammering. This couldn't be how it ended. Not like this. Not on a routine flight from Houston to Minneapolis. He thought about everything he'd never said to people he loved, about dreams unfulfilled, about the randomness and cruelty of the universe that could snatch life away in a storm. Around him he could hear prayers being whispered in multiple languages, everyone preparing for the possibility that these were their final moments. You won't believe what happened next. As Stephen descended through 8,000 feet, the turbulence suddenly became even more violent. The plane rolled hard to the right, over 45 degrees. Stephen fought to level it, but the controls felt mushy, not responding properly. "We've got structural damage," Amanda said, her voice cracking slightly. "The right wing is showing stress fractures on the sensors. We're losing hydraulic pressure in System 2. This was catastrophic. The plane was literally being torn apart by the storm. Stephen made a split-second calculation that would determine whether everyone lived or died. They were 30 miles from Columbia Regional Airport, descending through a killer storm on one engine, with structural damage and failing hydraulics. If they continued toward Columbia, they might not make it. The plane could break up in the air or become uncontrollable. But if they descended faster, dropped below the worst of the storm immediately, they might survive long enough to find somewhere, anywhere, to land. "I'm taking us down now," Stephen said. "Emergency descent. Amanda, notify ATC." He pushed the yoke forward, dropping the nose. The plane dove toward the ground at a rate that made passengers scream anew, but it was intentional, controlled, necessary. They plunged through 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The turbulence began to lessen as they got below the worst cell. At 3,000 feet, the shaking reduced to moderate levels. At 2,000 feet, the ride smoothed significantly. They dropped below the storm. But now they faced a new problem. They were flying at 2,000 feet above ground level, in the dark, in rain, on one engine, with a damaged aircraft and failing systems, somewhere over rural Missouri. Stephen's eyes scanned the darkness for any sign of a place to land. "Amanda, I need options. Airports, highways, anything flat and long." Amanda was already pulling up every resource. Columbia Regional is 22 miles northeast, but there's a small municipal airport, Moberly, 8 miles directly ahead, single runway, 4,200 feet, no tower, probably no lights, 8 miles versus 22 miles, a short runway versus a longer one, no services versus full emergency response. Stephen had seconds to decide. He looked at his instruments. Fuel was getting low from running on one engine at high power. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. The structural integrity warnings were getting worse. They might not have 22 miles left in this plane. "We're going to Moberly," he decided. "Amanda, try to raise them on CTAF frequency. Someone might be monitoring." Amanda switched frequencies and transmitted. Moberly traffic. This is Flight 771. Commercial aircraft declaring emergency. One engine out. Structural damage. Requesting immediate landing runway 18. Any personnel monitoring, please activate runway lighting. Silence. She tried again. Still nothing. They were on their own. Stephen aimed for where the GPS said Moberly Airport should be. In the darkness and rain, he couldn't see anything. No lights, no runway, nothing but black countryside below. Aaron and the other passengers had no idea what was happening. They just knew the plane was flying low, very low. Through breaks in the clouds, Aaron could see ground lights, houses, roads, much closer than they should be during normal flight. The remaining engine sound had changed too, laboring, struggling. Whatever was happening up front, it wasn't good. He resumed his brace position and waited, praying. At 1,000 feet above ground, Stephen still couldn't see the airport. Amanda pulled up satellite imagery on her iPad, trying to correlate landmarks. Should be 2 miles ahead, just past that highway intersection. Stephen strained his eyes. Come on, he thought. Show yourself. Then Amanda shouted. There, 11 o'clock, dark strip in the field. Stephen saw it, a slightly darker rectangle in the darkness, barely visible. That was their runway, their only hope. Gear down, Stephen ordered. Amanda pulled the lever. They waited for the confirmation lights. 2 green lights illuminated, but the nose gear lights stayed dark. Nose gear isn't showing down, Amanda said. With their hydraulic problems, the nose gear might be stuck. Landing without a nose gear meant the plane would collapse forward on touchdown, potentially cartwheeling and exploding. But they had no time to troubleshoot, no altitude to circle and work the problem. They were landing now, nose gear or not. Stephen lined up with the dark runway, using every ounce of his skill and experience. The runway had no lights, no visual aids, just a dark strip of asphalt that he could barely distinguish from the surrounding fields. He was essentially landing blind in the dark. Amanda called out altitudes. 500 feet, 400, 300. The ground rushed up at them. Stephen held the approach speed precisely. Not too fast, not too slow. Everything had to be perfect or they'd crash. 200 feet, 100, 50. Stephen eased back on the power, flared the nose up. The main landing gear touched the runway with a screech of rubber and a shower of sparks from the damaged right wing dragging asphalt. Stephen held the nose up as long as possible, bleeding off speed. Slower, slower. At about 60 knots, the nose finally dropped. Without the nose gear locked in place, it collapsed immediately. The front of the plane slammed into the runway with a horrific grinding crash. Metal screamed against asphalt. Sparks flew. The plane skidded, veering right. In the cabin, passengers were thrown forward against their seatbelts. The sound was apocalyptic, like the plane was tearing itself apart, which it partially was. Aaron's head bounced off the seat in front of him, despite his brace position. Around him, people screamed. The plane slid sideways off the runway into the grass, plowing through wet field, finally coming to a shuddering stop. For a moment, absolute silence. Then Stephen's voice over the intercom. Evacuate! Everyone out now! Use all exits! Marcus and the other attendants sprang into action, throwing open emergency exits, deploying slides. Get out! Leave everything! Move, move, move! Passengers scrambled from their seats, rushing for exits in the dark. Aaron helped an elderly woman ahead of him, practically lifting her toward the exit. The smell of fuel was strong, terrifying. If something sparked, the whole plane could explode. People jumped onto the slides, tumbling into wet grass, running away from the wreckage. Stephen and Amanda were last out, evacuating through the cockpit window after ensuring every passenger and crew member had escaped first. They dropped into the grass and ran. Behind them, their broken aircraft sat dark and crumpled in a Missouri field, fuel leaking but mercifully not burning. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, volunteer fire department responding. But incredibly, everyone was out. Everyone was alive. Aaron collapsed in the grass 50 yards from the plane, soaking wet from rain, shaking with adrenaline and shock. Around him, passengers sat or stood in stunned groups, many crying, some laughing with the hysterical relief of survival. The volleyball team huddled together, all of them safe. A mother held her 2 young children, rocking them and sobbing. The flight attendant who'd been injured during turbulence was being helped by passengers. Her arm clearly broken, but she was alive and conscious. Marcus did a head count in the darkness, checking everyone off against his passenger manifest. 163 passengers, 6 crew members, all accounted for. 0 fatalities. He radioed this information to the approaching emergency vehicles. 0 fatalities. Against all odds, against probability and physics and the violence of nature, Captain Stephen Matthews had brought his dying plane down in the dark on an unlit runway and saved every soul on board. The investigation would later determine that Flight 771 had encountered a meteorological phenomenon called a mesoscale convective vortex, a type of storm system so rare and unpredictable that even modern radar struggles to identify it. The turbulence had exceeded design limits for commercial aircraft. The hail had been larger than forecast. The wind shear had been stronger than any in the system's database. Stephen Matthews had done nothing wrong. He'd been thrown into an impossible situation and had somehow found a way out. But here's what amazed investigators most. The decision to descend rapidly below the storm, to aim for the closer airport despite its limitations, to land without confirmed nose gear on an unlit runway in the dark, every decision violated standard procedures. By the book, Stephen should have continued to Columbia Regional, the bigger airport with emergency services, but by the book would have killed everyone. The plane would have broken up in the air or crashed short of the runway. Stephen's willingness to trust his instincts over procedures saved 169 lives. The NTSB investigator in charge said it plainly in his report. Captain Matthews faced a series of cascading emergencies that individually would challenge any pilot, and together created a scenario that should have been unsurvivable. His decision to deviate from standard emergency procedures, while controversial, demonstrated exceptional airmanship and judgment. The outcome speaks for itself. 0 fatalities. This is one of the most remarkable emergency landings in commercial aviation history. Aaron attended the NTSB hearing months later, wanting to understand what had happened that night. He listened to Stephen Matthews explain his decision-making process. "I knew we were dying up there," Stephen testified. "I could feel the plane coming apart. Every instinct, every bit of experience told me we didn't have time to reach Columbia. Moberly was closer, and closer meant more chance of survival. The runway was short and dark, yes, but any runway we could reach was better than no runway at all. I had to trust that I could get us down safely, even without ideal conditions." The hearing room full of aviation experts gave Stephen Matthews a standing ovation, an unprecedented moment at an NTSB investigation. His decision-making was added to training curricula for pilots worldwide. Sometimes the lesson went, doing everything right by the book isn't enough. Sometimes you have to trust your experience and make the call that seems wrong but feels right. Stephen Matthews had made that call, and everyone lived because of it. Amanda Rivera, the first officer, gave emotional testimony about Stephen's leadership during the crisis. He never panicked, never froze. When the engine failed, he immediately began solving problems. When the structural damage became apparent, he adapted. When it was clear we couldn't make Columbia, he found us another option. I've never seen anyone handle multiple cascading emergencies with such calm and effectiveness. He saved my life and everyone else's through sheer skill and courage. The airline industry recognized Captain Matthews with virtually every award available. The Airline Pilots Association gave him their Superior Airmanship Award. The Flight Safety Foundation honored him. Even NASA invited him to speak about decision-making under extreme stress. But Stephen remained humble through it all. "I was doing my job," he'd say. "I had 169 people trusting me to get them down safely. I wasn't going to let them down. Any captain worth their wings would have done the same thing." But Aaron knew that wasn't true. Not every captain could have done what Stephen did. Some would have frozen in panic. Others would have stuck rigidly to procedures even as the situation deteriorated. Stephen's unique combination of experience, skill, adaptability, and courage had been the difference between life and death. Aaron wrote extensively about the flight, and his articles helped the public understand what an extraordinary feat of airmanship they'd witnessed. The passengers of Flight 771 formed a survivors group that met annually. Aaron attended every gathering. They'd share updates on their lives, the births and graduations and marriages that they'd gotten to experience because they'd lived. They'd remember the terror and the miracle, and they'd honor Captain Stephen Matthews and First Officer Amanda Rivera, whose skill had given them their futures. At the 5th anniversary gathering, they presented Stephen with a plaque signed by every passenger. It read, "To Captain Matthews, who gave us tomorrow, with eternal gratitude." Marcus Webb, the lead flight attendant, struggled with PTSD after the incident. The terror of that turbulence, the helplessness of watching the cabin disintegrate around him, the certainty that they were all about to die, it haunted him. He took medical leave and underwent therapy. Eventually, he returned to flying, but he never forgot Flight 707. "I think about it every time I buckle into my jump seat," he told Aaron. "I remember how fragile everything is, how quickly routine can become catastrophe. But I also remember Stephen's voice on the intercom telling us to evacuate. That calm, authoritative voice that meant we'd made it. He'd saved us. I fly because I believe in pilots like Stephen Matthews." The physical aftermath was significant. The Boeing 757 aircraft was destroyed beyond repair, written off as a total loss. But it had done its job, protecting its passengers even as it was torn apart by forces it was never designed to withstand. Boeing engineers studied the wreckage extensively, looking for ways to improve aircraft resilience. Some of their findings led to design modifications in newer aircraft. Flight 771's destruction contributed to making future flights safer. Stephen Matthews retired from flying 2 years after the incident, at age 60. Not because of trauma or loss of nerve, but simply because it was time. His final flight was a victory lap of sorts, from Houston to Minneapolis on the same route as Flight 771, this time in perfect weather. The entire crew from the emergency flight was there, and many of the original passengers bought tickets specifically to fly with Captain Matthews one more time. When he landed smoothly in Minneapolis and taxied to the gate, the tower controller said, "Captain Matthews, on behalf of everyone in aviation, thank you for your service. You've set a standard we all aspire to. Clear skies and tailwinds, sir." Aaron was on that final flight, and he watched as Stephen removed his captain's hat for the last time. There were tears in the old pilot's eyes, but also satisfaction. He'd served honorably, he'd saved lives when it mattered most, and he was going out on his own terms. Amanda Rivera was his first officer again, now a captain herself and commanding her own flights. "Stephen taught me what it means to be a pilot," Amanda said at his retirement party. "It's not about flying when conditions are perfect, it's about finding solutions when everything goes wrong. I carry his lessons with me into every cockpit." The impact of Flight 771 extended beyond aviation. The story became a case study in crisis management, in decision-making under pressure, in the importance of experience and adaptability. Business schools taught it, military academies analyzed it, medical schools used it to discuss triage decisions in emergency rooms. Stephen Matthews' choice to deviate from protocol to save lives resonated far beyond flying. It spoke to a universal truth: sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Aaron's final article about Flight 771, written 10 years after the incident, focused on the concept of impossible decisions. Stephen Matthews faced choices no one should have to make, Aaron wrote. Continue to the better airport and risk breaking apart in flight, or aim for the inadequate airport that might be just barely reachable. Land without confirmed nose gear or keep trying to get it down and possibly run out of runway. Follow procedures or trust instinct. He chose survival over protocol every time, and everyone lived because of those choices. The article concluded with Stephen's own words from an interview Aaron had conducted on the eve of his retirement. "I don't know if I made the right decisions that night. I just made the decisions I could live with. If we'd crashed, investigators would have picked apart everything I did and found all the places I deviated from procedure. They'd have blamed me for the deaths. But we didn't crash, we lived. Does that make my decisions right, or just lucky? I think about that a lot. I think that's what leadership is, though. Making decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure, accepting the responsibility for the outcome. I'm proud we all lived. That's enough for me." 15 years after Flight 771, Aaron visited Stephen at his home in Colorado. The retired captain spent his days hiking, reading, and occasionally mentoring young pilots. They sat on his deck overlooking mountains, drinking coffee as the sun rose. "Do you ever think about that night?" Aaron asked. Stephen smiled. "Every day. Not in a traumatic way. More like gratitude. Gratitude that I had the skills when they were needed. Gratitude that Amanda was so capable under pressure. Gratitude that the plane held together just long enough. Gratitude for every sunrise since then that all those people got to see." Aaron asked the question he'd been saving. "If you could go back knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently?" Stephen thought for a long time. "I'd trust myself sooner. I spent the first minutes of the emergency running standard procedures, trying to handle it by the book. But this wasn't a book scenario. This was novel, unprecedented. The moment I stopped trying to fit the situation into existing frameworks and just started solving problems creatively, that's when we had a chance. If I'd recognized that sooner, maybe I could have saved the plane, not just the people. But honestly, I'd make the same core decisions. Descend fast, aim for the closer airport, land however we could. Those choices gave us our best odds. I'd do it all again exactly the same way." The passengers of Flight 771 carried their survival with them in different ways. Some became more fearful, avoiding flying whenever possible. Others became more philosophical, seeing each day as a gift. Several became pilots themselves, inspired by Stephen's heroism. One passenger, a teenager during the incident, joined the Air Force and became a fighter pilot, directly citing Captain Matthews as his inspiration. "He showed me what courage and skill under pressure looks like," the young pilot said. "I want to be that person for others." Amanda Rivera, now a senior captain and Czech airman, trained new pilots on how to handle emergencies. She'd always include Flight 771 in her scenarios. "What Captain Matthews taught me," she'd tell her students, "is that your most important instrument is up here." She'd tap her head, and here, tapping her heart. Technology and procedures can only take you so far. When you're in the impossible situation, when everything is going wrong, you need judgment, instinct, and the courage to trust yourself. Those aren't things you can learn from a checklist. They come from experience, practice, and the willingness to make hard decisions. Aaron's book about extraordinary people in crisis situations featured Flight 771 prominently. It became a bestseller, introducing millions of readers to Stephen Matthews' story. The response was overwhelming. Readers wrote to Aaron describing how the story had inspired them to trust their judgment in their own crisis moments. A doctor wrote about making an unorthodox call in an emergency room that saved a patient. A firefighter described deviating from procedure during a rescue. A teacher explained how she'd broken protocol to protect a student from danger. Stephen's example had rippled out, touching lives he'd never meet. 20 years after Flight 771, on the anniversary, all the survivors who were still living gathered at a memorial park in Moberly, Missouri. The town had erected a small monument near the old airport, which had since been expanded and improved, partly due to the attention from the emergency landing. The monument read, Flight 771, April 23rd. 169 souls flew into danger here and walked away into life. A testament to human skill, courage, and the refusal to accept the impossible. Stephen Matthews, now 78 years old, and moving slowly but still sharp, stood before the gathered crowd. Former passengers, now older themselves, some with children and grandchildren they'd never have had without him. He looked at their faces and spoke. 20 years ago, we shared the worst night of our lives together. And because we shared it, because we survived it together, we have all these years afterward. I look at you all now, at the lives you've built, the families you've raised, the contributions you've made to the world. That's my real legacy. Not the emergency landing itself, but all the life that came after it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reminding me why it mattered so much to get us down safely. Aaron stood in the back, watching this moment and feeling emotions well up. This was justice, he thought. Not legal justice, though that had its place. Not divine justice, whatever that might be. But something else. The justice of expertise applied at the crucial moment, of courage defeating fear, of skill triumphing over chaos, of one person refusing to accept that death was inevitable and finding a way against all odds to choose life for everyone in their care. That night at the hotel, Aaron wrote in his journal, Stephen Matthews saved 169 lives on Flight 700, but he also saved all the lives those people would touch. The children they'd raise, the students they'd teach, the patients they'd heal, the businesses they'd build, the art they'd create. When you save a life, you don't just save that one person. You save everyone they'll influence, everyone who will be born because they lived, everyone who will benefit from their continued existence. Stephen's impossible decision in that cockpit created ripples that will extend for generations. That's power. That's what heroism really means. The story of Flight 771 never grew old because it spoke to something fundamental in human nature. The belief that impossible situations can be survived, that skill and courage matter, that one person's decisions can mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. Stephen Matthews became a symbol of something people needed to believe in, that when everything goes wrong, expertise and determination can still prevail, that we're not helpless in the face of chaos, that impossible is just another problem to solve. Captain Stephen Matthews died peacefully in his sleep at age 83, 5 years after that final gathering in Moberly. His obituary was front-page news. Airlines worldwide observed a moment of silence in his honor. But his real memorial was written in the lives of the people he'd saved. They carried his legacy forward in how they lived, in the risks they took, in the impossible problems they refused to accept as unsolvable. He'd shown them that impossible just means nobody's done it yet. And sometimes, in the darkest moment, in the broken plane falling through the storm, someone figures out how to do the impossible. Stephen Matthews had been that someone. And 169 people walked away from certain death because of it. That's the story Aaron wanted told. Not just the technical details of the emergency, though those were important. Not just the investigation and awards, though those had their place, but the deeper story. That justice sometimes looks like a pilot who refuses to give up. That power sometimes looks like skill applied at the crucial moment. That heroism sometimes looks like making the call that goes against everything you've been taught because your instinct says it's the only way everyone survives. Captain Stephen Matthews had made that call. And the world was better because he'd trusted himself enough to make the impossible decision that saved everyone.